The conference room at Henderson and Associates smelled like stale coffee and old grudges. My Aunt Patricia had already claimed the corner seat, the one closest to the lawyer's desk, as if proximity to power meant she'd walk away with more. Her daughters, my cousins Brooke and Megan, flanked her on either side like bodyguards at a jewelry store. Across the table, my Uncle Dennis sat with his son Tyler, who was scrolling through his phone, probably already calculating what a vintage Cartier bracelet would fetch on eBay. I sat at the far end of the table, the seat nobody wanted, right next to the door. That was always my place in this family. Close enough to be counted, far enough to be forgotten. Mr. Henderson opened a leather folder and began reading Grandma Helen's last will and testament. She had passed 3 weeks ago, quietly, in her sleep, in the small Connecticut farmhouse where she'd lived alone for the past 20 years. She was 91. The funeral had been brief, the grieving, briefer. To my daughter, Patricia, I leave my jewelry collection, including the sapphire necklace, the pearl earrings, and the diamond tennis bracelet. Mr. Henderson read in that flat, professional tone lawyers use when they know a storm is coming. Aunt Patricia's eyes gleamed. She reached across the table and squeezed Brooke's hand. "I knew it," she whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Mother always said I had her taste." Brooke was already on her phone, probably texting her husband the good news. "To my son, Dennis, I leave the farmhouse and the 2 acres of property on which it sits, along with all furnishings not otherwise specified." Uncle Dennis leaned back with a satisfied nod. That farmhouse sat on land that had tripled in value over the last decade. Even if he tore the place down, the lot alone was worth close to $700,000. To my granddaughter Brooke, I leave the china collection, the complete royal Doulton set. To my granddaughter Megan, the silver flatware set and the crystal stemware. To my grandson Tyler, the 1967 Ford Mustang in the garage and the coin collection. Tyler actually looked up from his phone for that one. The Mustang was a legend in our family. Grandpa had restored it himself before he died, and every cousin had wanted it. Tyler pumped his fist under the table like he'd just won the lottery. Mr. Henderson paused, adjusted his glasses, and continued. To my granddaughter Nora, I leave the steamer trunk in the attic bedroom. She will know why. The room went quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then Brooke snorted. "The trunk." She looked at me with a mixture of pity and amusement. "That ugly green thing covered in dust?" "I know which one she means," Megan added. "It smells like mothballs and sadness. We tried to open it once when we were kids, remember? It was locked, and Grandma nearly had a heart attack." Aunt Patricia shook her head slowly. "Well, Nora, I suppose someone had to get the junk. At least you can use it as a coffee table." I didn't say anything. I never did at these things. That was the role my family had assigned me a long time ago. Quiet Nora, bookish Nora, the one who worked at the county library and drove a 10-year-old Subaru and never had anything interesting to say at Thanksgiving. The one who visited Grandma every single weekend for the past 8 years while the rest of them showed up twice a year with a poinsettia or a box of chocolates and called it love. There's also this. Mr. Henderson handed me a small brass key and a sealed envelope, to be opened privately, per Mrs. Whitfield's instructions. "Probably the recipe for her apple butter," Tyler said, and the table erupted in laughter. I took the key and the envelope, thanked Mr. Henderson, and walked out while they were still dividing up the smaller items, arguing over who got the KitchenAid mixer and whether the garden tools counted as furnishings. The drive from Hartford to my apartment in New Haven took 45 minutes. The trunk was in my back seat, wedged diagonally, because it was bigger than I remembered. It was army green with brass hardware, scratched and dented, with stickers on the side that had faded beyond reading. It smelled like cedar and lavender, and something about that combination made my chest ache so badly I had to pull over twice. Grandma Helen had been the center of my universe. After my mother, her youngest daughter, died of cancer when I was 14, Grandma was the one who showed up. Not Aunt Patricia, not Uncle Dennis. Grandma. She'd driven 4 hours to sit beside me in the hospital. She'd moved into our guest room for 3 months to make sure I ate breakfast and did my homework and didn't drown in grief. She taught me to cook, to garden, to read poetry aloud, and to believe that quiet people aren't weak, they're just listening harder than everyone else. When I got home, I made chamomile tea in the mug she'd given me for my 30th birthday. The one with the chipped handle that my cousins called garbage. I sat on the living room floor with the trunk in front of me and slid the brass key into the lock. It turned with a clean click, like it had been waiting. The first thing I saw was a uniform. A military uniform, pressed and folded with a kind of precision that spoke of discipline and respect. Women's Army Corps. I lifted it out carefully. Beneath it was a beret, and beneath that, a photograph I'd never seen before. A young woman in her 20s, dark-haired and sharp-eyed, standing in front of a building, with a sign I couldn't quite read. She was smiling, but it wasn't a soft smile. It was the smile of someone who knew things other people didn't. It was Grandma. I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter in her handwriting, the same elegant cursive she'd used on every birthday card she ever sent me. My dearest Nora, if you're reading this, then I've finally run out of time, and you're probably sitting on your living room floor wondering what on earth your crazy old grandmother left you. Don't worry, I'm going to explain everything. But first, I need you to understand something. The woman you knew as Helen Whitfield, the one who baked pies and grew tomatoes and watched Jeopardy every evening at 7, that woman was real, but she wasn't all of me. Before I was your grandmother, I was Lieutenant Helen Calloway, United States Army Intelligence, and I have never told a living soul. I set the letter down because my hands were shaking too hard to hold it. I picked up the tea, took a sip, and kept reading. In 1951, I was recruited out of Barnard College by a man who said he worked for the State Department. He didn't. He worked for a division of Army intelligence that officially didn't exist. I spent the next 12 years as a cryptanalyst and field operative during the Cold War. I broke Soviet codes. I ran assets in East Berlin. I was captured once, in Prague, in 1958, and I escaped by jumping from a second-story window into the Vltava River in November. The water was so cold, I couldn't feel my legs for 2 days, but I made it out, and so did the family I was helping to defect. I stared at the photograph again, the building behind her. I grabbed my phone and zoomed in. The sign was in German. The letter continued. When I left the service in 1963, I was given a commendation that I was told I could never display, a pension that I was told I could never explain, and a new identity. Helen Calloway became Helen Whitfield. I married your grandfather, a good man who knew nothing about my past and loved me anyway. I kept my silence for 60 years, not because I was told to, but because the memories were too heavy to carry into a normal life. Beneath the uniform were more documents. Declassified files with her photograph attached, stamped with markings I recognized from history documentaries. Confidential, later downgraded to unclassified. Mission reports typed on onion skin paper. A commendation letter signed by someone whose name I'd seen in textbooks. Maps of Berlin with routes marked in red pencil. A German-English dictionary with notes in the margins, translations she'd puzzled over late at night, I imagined, while the world slept and she fought a war nobody knew she was fighting. And then, at the bottom of the trunk, wrapped in a velvet cloth, was a medal. A Defense Distinguished Service Medal. I didn't recognize it at first, but I looked it up, and when the search results loaded, I had to set my phone down and just breathe. It was one of the highest awards the Department of Defense could bestow. My grandmother had been a war hero, and not a single person in our family had any idea. But that wasn't the end of the letter, not even close. Nora, there's a practical matter I need you to handle. During my years of service, I worked with several individuals who later became quite successful in the private sector. 2 of them, out of gratitude for operations I cannot describe here, established trust funds in my operational name. I never touched them. I never felt right about it, but I also couldn't bring myself to close them. I suppose vanity is a hard thing to kill, even in a spy. The details are in the brown envelope at the very bottom of the trunk. There's also a key to a safety deposit box at First Republic Bank in Washington, D.C. You'll need your passport and the letter of authorization I've included. The brown envelope contained account statements from 2 investment firms. The numbers didn't make sense to me at first. I thought I was reading them wrong. I called my friend David, who worked in finance, and read him the figures without explaining where they came from. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Nora, if these numbers are real, you're looking at somewhere north of $30 million. With the way these were structured, in the 60s, with compound growth over 60 years. Who the hell set these up? I told him I'd explain later and hung up. It took me a full week to process what had happened. 7 days of reading her mission reports, her personal journals, her coded notes that I slowly learned to decipher using the key she'd left me. She'd written everything in a personal code, a hybrid of the Soviet cipher she'd cracked in 1954 and a system of her own invention. The journals read like a thriller. The woman who taught me to make pot roast had once smuggled microfilm across the Czech border in the false bottom of a suitcase. The woman who did the crossword in pen every Sunday had decoded a transmission that prevented an assassination. The woman who called me every Thursday at 6 to ask about my week had, in another life, gone by a code name that intelligence historians had been searching for since the archives were partially declassified in 2001. They called her the Sparrow. I found references to the Sparrow in 3 separate history books at my own library. An unnamed female operative who had been instrumental in at least 4 major Cold War intelligence operations. Historians had debated for years whether the Sparrow was one person or a composite of several agents. The answer had been living in a Connecticut farmhouse, baking pies. Then came Thanksgiving. I pulled up to Uncle Dennis's house in my same Subaru, wearing my same corduroy jacket and library lanyard I'd forgotten to take off. Brooke arrived in a new Range Rover. Megan had gotten her hair done and was wearing the silver earrings from Grandma's collection, the ones she'd already had appraised. Tyler roared up in the Mustang, freshly detailed, with vanity plates that read, "Vintage." Aunt Patricia cornered me in the kitchen within 5 minutes. "Nora, sweetheart, how are you? I know the holidays must be hard on a librarian's salary. If you ever need anything, and I mean this sincerely, we're family." She said this while wearing Grandma's sapphire necklace. The one Grandma had once told me she bought at a flea market in Berlin. I now knew which Berlin she'd meant, and it wasn't a flea market. At dinner, they couldn't help themselves. I had the bracelet appraised, Aunt Patricia announced, pouring herself more wine. $12,000. Can you believe Mother had such exquisite taste? "That's nothing," Tyler said. "The coin collection has a 1909 SVDB Lincoln penny. I looked it up. Could be worth over $1,000 on its own." Megan held up her wrist. "The silver set is Georg Jensen, 1950s. The whole set could fetch $8,000 to $10,000 at auction." They went around the table like it was show and tell. Each item, each price, each number spoken with the casual satisfaction of people who believed they had won. Eventually, Brooke turned to me with the expression she always wore when she was about to say something cruel wrapped in kindness. "So, Nora, whatever happened with that old trunk? Did you find anything interesting in there? Or was it just mothballs?" The table chuckled. I took a sip of water. "Actually," I said, "I had the contents examined by a specialist." The chuckling stopped. "Oh?" Aunt Patricia set down her wine glass. "What kind of specialist?" "A historian," I said, "from Georgetown University. She specializes in Cold War intelligence operations." The silence was thick enough to cut. I pulled out my phone and showed them a photograph I'd taken. Not of the bank statements, not of the medal, just one of the declassified mission reports, with Grandma's operational photograph attached. The young woman with the sharp smile, in front of the building in Berlin. Grandma Helen wasn't just a housewife, I said. She was a military intelligence officer during the Cold War. She was a cryptanalyst and a field operative. She spent 12 years breaking Soviet codes and running classified operations across Eastern Europe. "That's ridiculous," Uncle Dennis said, but his voice had no conviction. "It's documented," I said. Declassified files. Her operational codename was the Sparrow. Military historians have been looking for her identity for over 20 years. The trunk contained her service records, her personal journals, her medals, and enough primary source material to rewrite 3 chapters of Cold War history. Brooke's face had gone completely white. "How much is all that worth?" I looked at her for a long moment. "The Smithsonian has already reached out," I said. "So has the National Cryptologic Museum at Fort Meade. 3 universities want to archive her journals, and I've been contacted by 2 publishers about a book." "A book," Megan whispered, "about her missions. Her life. The things she saw and did that none of us ever knew about." I paused. I'm donating the historical materials to the National Archives. And the book proceeds will fund a scholarship in her name for women in intelligence and cryptography. You're giving it away. Aunt Patricia's voice cracked. Nora, if those documents are historically significant, collectors would pay. You have no idea what people pay for authentic Cold War memorabilia. I know exactly what they're worth, I said. Tyler leaned forward. But the trunk itself. What about the trunk? Is it military issue? Vintage military gear. Sells for serious money online. I almost laughed. Of all the things to focus on, the trunk is staying with me, I said, along with her uniform and her medal. What medal? Uncle Dennis asked. Defense Distinguished Service Medal, I said. One of the highest honors, the Department of Defense awards. The table was silent. Aunt Patricia touched the sapphire necklace at her throat, and for the first time, I saw something flicker across her face that might have been doubt. I stood to help clear the dishes, and Megan followed me into the kitchen. Nora, she said, her voice low and urgent. We're family. Grandma would have wanted all of us to benefit from this. You can't just keep everything for yourself. I dried a plate and set it carefully in the rack. Grandma left each of us exactly what she thought we deserved. I said, you got the silver. I got the truth. But if there's money from the book isn't about money, I said. Just like those weekends I spent with her weren't about inheritance. They were about love. She told me stories every single Saturday for 8 years. While the rest of you sent gift cards and skipped her birthday, I was there. Listening. Megan opened her mouth, then closed it. She looked at the sapphire necklace through the kitchen doorway, glinting on her mother's neck, and I watched the math change behind her eyes. As I was putting on my coat to leave, Aunt Patricia caught me at the door. Nora. She gripped my arm with more force than I expected from a woman who complained about her arthritis at every family gathering. I want to see those documents. I have a right. She was my mother. You had 30 years to ask her about her life, I said gently. She was right here, every Sunday, every holiday, every random Tuesday. She was right here with stories she was dying to share. And nobody asked. Nobody listened. Nobody sat with her and said, tell me who you were. Aunt Patricia's hand dropped. She stared at me like I'd slapped her. I drove home in the dark, the November air sharp through my cracked window. The highway was empty, and I let myself cry for the first time since the lawyer's office. Not out of sadness, exactly, but out of something more complicated. Grief and gratitude, and rage and love all twisted together like the codes Grandma used to break. I hadn't told them about the trust funds. That secret would stay between Grandma and me, at least until the foundation was ready. I had plans for that money. A scholarship fund, yes, but also a wing at the Cryptologic Museum, dedicated to the women who served in intelligence and never received public recognition. A grant program for female veterans transitioning to civilian careers. And a small, quiet memorial in the Connecticut farmhouse, if Uncle Dennis would allow it, though I suspected once he learned the full truth, he'd try to sell the property to the highest bidder rather than preserve anything. Let him try. I had $30 million in trust funds and a team of lawyers I hadn't hired yet, but absolutely would. Back in my apartment, I sat on the floor with the trunk open beside me. I held the medal in my palm, feeling the weight of it. It was heavier than I expected. Or maybe it just carried more than metal. I picked up her journal, the last one, dated the year before she died, and turned to the final entry. My darling Nora. They'll tell you I was just a grandmother. Just a woman who grew old in a farmhouse and left behind some jewelry and a rusty car and a set of dishes. Let them believe it. The people who need the truth will find it. And you, my girl, have always been the one who finds things. You found the first edition Hemingway in the library basement. You found the injured cat behind the grocery store and nursed it back to health. You found me, every Saturday, when nobody else bothered to look. I'm leaving you this trunk not because it contains secrets, though it does, but because you're the only one in this family who understands that some things are more valuable than what they sell for. You understand that a story matters more than a stone, that a life lived bravely is worth more than a bracelet worn carelessly. The accounts are real. The money is real. Use it wisely. But more than that, use my story. Tell people that ordinary women did extraordinary things and were never thanked for it. Tell them that the grandmother who made apple butter also broke ciphers that kept this country safe. Tell them that courage doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it wears an apron, and a pair of reading glasses and sits in a rocking chair, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. You always ask the right questions, Nora. All my love, all my secrets, all my trust. Grandma Helen. I closed the journal and held it against my chest. Through my apartment window, the November sky was clear and full of stars, the same stars she'd navigated by on a freezing night in Prague in 1958, the same stars she'd watched from her farmhouse porch every evening for 60 years afterward, keeping her silence, keeping her secrets, keeping her faith that someday the right person would open the trunk and understand. The historian from Georgetown had cried when she read the journals. She'd actually pushed back from her desk and put her hands over her face and wept. "We've been looking for the sparrow for 23 years, she said. Every intelligent scholar in the Western world has a theory about who she was, and she was living in Connecticut, making apple butter. My cousins would find out about the money eventually. When the foundation was announced, when the news picked up the story, when the book was published, and the interviews started, and the documentary crew came calling, they'd be furious. They'd claim I manipulated a dying woman. They'd probably contest the will, hire lawyers, drag out proceedings for years. Let them. I had 60 years of compound interest, airtight declassified documentation, and the kind of receipts that don't expire. More importantly, I had the truth. I had her voice on the recordings I'd made every Saturday for 8 years, 1,200 hours of a woman the world had overlooked, telling stories the world desperately needed to hear. I had her journals, her codes, her maps, her medals, and the quiet, unshakable knowledge that the woman who taught me to be brave had been braver than anyone imagined. My cousins kept the jewelry. They kept the car. They kept the dishes and the flatware and the farmhouse. I kept the legacy. And every night, before I go to sleep, I open the trunk and touch the collar of her uniform, and I whisper the same thing she used to whisper to me when she tucked me in as a child, back when I thought she was just my grandmother, and she let me believe it because the world wasn't ready yet. "Good night, Sparrow," I say. "Your secret's safe with me." But not for much longer. The book comes out in the spring. The foundation launches in the summer. And somewhere, I like to think, a 91-year-old spy is finally getting the recognition she spent a lifetime earning and a lifetime hiding from. She left me a trunk full of secrets and a lifetime of Saturday afternoons. My cousins got sapphires and silver and a vintage Mustang. I think Grandma Helen would have appreciated the irony. She always did love a good code. And this last one, the one she built into her will, the one that separated the people who loved her from the people who loved her things, was the most elegant cipher she ever wrote.